Good morning, everyone. I'm Michelle Easton, president of the Clare, Boothe, Luce Policy Institute. I want to thank you all for coming and welcome you to our November Conservative Women's Network Luncheon. Special thank you to Genevieve, who is sitting in for Bridget today. We've had a wonderful partnership with Heritage. We've been doing this lunch now for 17 years. I'm so delighted to introduce Melanie Kirkpatrick to discuss her new book, Thanksgiving, the Holiday at the Heart of the American Experience. I think we can all agree that after a bruising election season, it's refreshing to pause as we approach the holidays and reflect on one of America's great traditions. We're so glad Melanie could join us today, coming down from Connecticut, and she is based there as a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, also here in Washington. She contributes reviews and commentary to various publications, including the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, and she has a piece there today. I hope you'll all look at it because it comes from the book, right? And she worked for the Wall Street Journal for many years as well, and she's actually there until the end of the year again. She was a longtime member of their editorial board and a deputy editor of the editorial page. She's also a director of the America for Bulgaria Foundation, a trustee of Princeton in Asia, and a member of the advisory board of the Human Freedom Program of the George W. Bush Institute. She holds an AB from Princeton and an MA from the University of Toronto. And in addition to Thanksgiving, she's the author of another fabulous book called Escape from North Korea, The Untold Story of Asia's Underground Railroad, published by Encounter Books in 2012. A couple of other little miscellaneous things about you. She's a devoted member of the Trollope Society. Those of you who like 18th century reading know what that is. And she loves to cook, and she loves to make pies, but unfortunately this year, because she's working so hard on the book, she's going to buy her pies. Please join me in welcoming Melanie Kirkpatrick.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction, and it's the first time anybody has introduced me, and including the information that I like to make pies. But it's appropriate. My book on Thanksgiving came out a couple of weeks ago, and I thought today what I would do is talk a little bit about what inspired me to write it, and then mention a couple of stories from my book, particular ones that I think particularly would be of interest to conservative women. So let me begin with why I wrote the book. It was September 11th, 2001, and I was in downtown Manhattan that day. I saw the towers fall. Afterwards, like so many Americans, I began to reflect a little more about what it means to be an American. And as Thanksgiving approached, I found myself reading William Bradford's of Plymouth Plantation, which if you haven't read, I really encourage you to do. Bradford was the longtime governor of Plymouth Plantation, and his journal is one of the great works of American literature. He tells the story of how the Pilgrims went from England to Holland and then on the Mayflower to the United States, and he follows then their history for a couple of decades here in the New World. It's a very powerful read and makes you really see what life must have been like for these early Americans. And as Thanksgiving approached, I jumped ahead to his account of the first Thanksgiving in the fall of 1621. It's only about 150 words, but it could speak for what Thanksgiving is like today. As he described it, it was a time of feasting and a time of fellowship with the Wampanoag Indians who joined them. And to my mind, it pointed the way to the multicultural people we are today. My book is a collection of stories, really. It looks at 400 years of history with Thanksgiving, beginning even before the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag Indians. And I speak a little bit about, I have a chapter where I discuss places in the United States that claim to be the site of the true first Thanksgiving. That is, they celebrated Thanksgivings before the Pilgrims and the Indians did, including 2 in Texas, which is your home state. One in Virginia, where I imagine some of you live, and one in Maine, and a couple in Florida. And it was very interesting to research those histories. I especially enjoyed reading about the one in Virginia, which took place on the James River near Richmond. And in 1962, when President Kennedy issued his first Thanksgiving proclamation, a Virginia state senator sent a telegram of protest saying, you should have mentioned Virginia, the site of the true first Thanksgiving. Well, it fell to one of Kennedy's aides to answer that letter, and that aide happened to be the very subsequently extremely famous American historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. So he wrote back to the Virginia state senator saying, "You're absolutely right. We apologize, but there is a New England bias at the White House." Kennedy, of course, was from Massachusetts. We'll correct it. And next year, Kennedy's proclamation, which was issued just shortly before his assassination, in his proclamation, he mentioned the original Thanksgivings in Virginia and Massachusetts, mentioning Virginia first, which Virginians were happy about. So that's the kind of story I had a lot of fun digging up as I look through 4 generations of history of the holiday. The book it opens with the Pilgrims, and then it also talks about the competitors to Thanksgiving that I just mentioned, and talks about how the Pilgrims became part of the holiday as well. They didn't the Thanksgiving tradition developed independent of the Pilgrims, and it wasn't until the 19th century that the Pilgrims were connected to Thanksgiving. That happened in part because William Bradford's journal had disappeared, and the story of Thanksgiving was not discovered until the book and another eyewitness account both reappeared in the 19th century. And I also talk about the political, how it was involved with a number of political issues in our history. I talk about the history of football and how it became associated with Thanksgiving. I talk about, in one chapter, Native Americans and their attitude toward Thanksgiving. There's another chapter on Thanksgiving generosity, how generosity and the holiday of Thanksgiving have always been closely connected. And, of course, there's a chapter on dinner and the history of that. So in the Q&A session, I can give you this overview so that in the Q&A session, if you have questions about any of these topics, I'd be more than happy to answer them. But today, I want to focus on the story, 2 stories. First of Sarah Josepha Hale, who is known as the godmother of Thanksgiving. And the other story I'll tell is the one of George Washington and the debate in the first Congress of the United States about whether or not the president had the authority to issue a Thanksgiving proclamation. So first, Mrs. Hale. Sarah Josepha Hale was a New Englander born in New Hampshire in 1788, and unlike most women of her day, she was very highly educated, thanks to her mother, her father, and her brother. Her mother homeschooled all of the children, so she got a good education there. And then her brother went off to Dartmouth and received a college education. And when he came home on visits, he would teach everything he had been taught to Sarah, who, as I say, was really interested in a lot of intellectual issues. And then she, at the late age, she got married. At the late age for the time, of 25. And she and her husband, who was an attorney, would at night sit by the fireside and study such things as botany, French, history, and literature. When she was 34, he died, leaving her with 4 children, a 5th on the way, and no money, nothing to live on. So she began to write. Her writings were published, and she wrote a novel called Northwood that was popular and was even published in England, which was quite an accomplishment for an American writer. In 1834, she became editor of a women's magazine in Boston, and her work caught the attention of a publisher in Philadelphia who had a magazine that he was nurturing, and he knew that the only way he could get Sarah Joseph Hale was to buy the magazine she worked for. So she did that. He did that. She moved to Philadelphia and became editor of Godey's Ladies' Book. Now, what made Sarah Joseph Hale one of America's great editors was the following. Unlike most editors of magazines in America, she wanted to publish articles about American things written by Americans. This, you would think, would be an obvious job for an editor, but that wasn't the case back then. Back then, most magazines and newspapers republished articles that they had stolen, in effect, from British newspapers and magazines. There wasn't an international copyright at the time. So Sarah Joseph Hale at Godey's Ladies' Book had the backing of her publisher, who was willing to pay for her to hire Americans to write about American themes. So she hired and published articles by such people as Harriet Beecher Stowe, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Edgar Allan Poe, just to name a few. And my favorite quote about Sarah Joseph Hale comes from Edgar Allan Poe, who called her a woman of masculine energy. So I think that was a compliment.
Back in the day.
Right. So because of her interest in things American, she was also interested in Thanksgiving. And starting very early on, indeed in her first novel, before she became an editor, she would write about Thanksgiving. And when she got to Godey's Ladies' Book, she used the pages of her magazine to promote the idea of a national Thanksgiving. At the time, Thanksgivings were called by individual states, and they were celebrated on days that would range from the beginning of October or the end of September until the beginning of December. The country did not celebrate on the same day. So it was Sarah Joseph Hale's ambition to have our country have a single Thanksgiving where we could come together and give thanks for our blessings as a nation. She saw Thanksgiving, which was a homegrown holiday, along the lines akin to the 4th of July and Washington's birthday. That is, for her, it was a kind of patriotic holiday, a time to celebrate our blessings as Americans. So in addition to publishing editorials calling for a national Thanksgiving, she would also publish fiction that was set around the Thanksgiving holiday as a way to give her readers an idea of what a Thanksgiving could be like. They were usually pretty sentimental stories, but they were marvelous to read, especially when it came to describing what everybody was having for dinner. And she did something else that was brilliant, and I think she may have been the first editor to do this. She published recipes. And she asked her readers to send in recipes. So a lot of the classic Thanksgiving recipes were found in the pages of her magazine, and indeed she compiled them in a couple of cookbooks as well. In addition to all of her work at Godey's Ladies' Book on Thanksgiving, she pursued her cause in another way. She conducted a series of letter writing campaigns. Every year she would write to dozens, maybe hundreds of important political and other figures in the United States, trying to get them to sign on to her idea of a national Thanksgiving. She wrote to every president since at least Zachary Taylor, and maybe earlier, maybe starting with James Polk. And she never got a reply that I know of until 1863, when Abraham Lincoln decided, in the middle of the Civil War, to call a national Thanksgiving. Now, Lincoln and Jefferson Davis had both issued Thanksgiving proclamations to give thanks for victories in the Civil War. But nobody since George Washington had called for a national Thanksgiving for general blessings. So when Lincoln did this, it was quite extraordinary. First of all, the country was divided, and Americans were literally killing each other. Second, it was probably the bloodiest year in American history. The Battle of Gettysburg had recently taken place, and surely the last thing on Americans' minds, North or South, would have been things to be thankful for. And yet Lincoln listed them all in his proclamation: the good crops, the good weather, and he really was pointing the way to what the country would become when it was at peace again. So Sarah Joseph Hale was the one who was responsible for that, and she lived to be 90. And shortly before her death, she was interviewed. She was working all the time, and shortly before her death, she was interviewed about Thanksgiving and Lincoln's decision to do that. And she said how happy she was and glad that she had been successful, but there was still one thing left, and that was Congress had to pass legislation making it a national holiday. And Congress didn't do that until 1941. And if you want to know more about that, you can ask me during our Q&A. But for my second story, I'd like to go backwards in time and talk about George Washington and our first national Thanksgiving, the one that inspired Sarah Joseph Hale to want to make it a permanent fixture in our national calendar. And in 1789, the first Congress of the United States was meeting not in Washington, but in Lower Manhattan, which was New York was the capital of the country at the time. They were meeting in Federal Hall, and they've been meeting there since March, trying to figure out, debating how to implement the Constitution of the United States. So, for example, they had to create the whole federal court system. That was one of their accomplishments. That Congress is often called the most productive Congress we've ever had. And when September came around, they were getting ready to recess. And a congressman from New Jersey, Elias Boudinot, rose and introduced a resolution to ask the president to issue a proclamation naming a day of national Thanksgiving. Well, I think to his surprise, certainly to mine when I read about it, this resolution was controversial. Why? Well, for two reasons, and reasons that are relevant today and have to do with our continuing national political conversation. The first was executive power, and some members of Congress felt that the Constitution did not give the president the authority to issue a proclamation naming a day of Thanksgiving. They argued that that authority devolved to the governors of the individual states, not to our president. The second objection had to do with the separation of church and state. The Congress had just debated the text of the First Amendment, and some people felt that Thanksgiving, being a religious matter, was outside the authority of the president. In the end, the resolution passed. A delegation from Congress went to the president asking him to declare a day of national Thanksgiving. He did so, but Washington, who was wise in so many matters, was, I think, wise in this one as well. He issued his proclamation, which, by the way, was the first presidential proclamation, not just the first Thanksgiving proclamation, but the first proclamation of any sort. He issued the proclamation, and then he sent it to the governors of the 13 states. And in his cover note, he said he requested the favor of them to celebrate this national Thanksgiving in their state. That is, he requested them to do so. He didn't order them to do so. So this indicates to me that he had paid attention to the debate in Congress, and it was tipping his hat toward that debate. Washington was very, I think, as you know, he was very conscious of the fact that as the first president, he was setting precedents in everything he did. So two things I will tell you about that first proclamation, which have resonance today, two other things. And one is that his Thanksgiving proclamation was religiously inclusive. It did not single out Christians. He invited people of all faiths to celebrate the holiday. And this has been the case in virtually every presidential proclamation since Lincoln. There have been a couple of presidents have slipped up a little bit, but making a reference to a specific religion. But this has been the case, and all of our national Thanksgivings have been religiously inclusive. And it's really that rarest of religious holidays, one, and I would argue it is a religious holiday, one that can be celebrated by people of any faith or of no faith. The second thing he did, which and set an example for us, was that he made a donation, a charitable donation, on Thanksgiving Day. And not only did he make it, he made sure that it was publicly known that he had made it. And in doing so, he was helping to establish a tradition of thinking of the poor and the less fortunate on Thanksgiving Day. This actually was a tradition that began in 1636 in Scituate, Massachusetts, where there was a day of Thanksgiving proclaimed by the church in town. And in addition to calling for a day of Thanksgiving, they asked the richer folk to include the poorer folk in their, to think of them, which would mean include them in their dinner. So Washington was reinforcing that tradition and, I think, setting a model for us to follow. In conclusion, and then I'll welcome your questions, I'd like to talk about a Thanksgiving tradition that I would like to see revived. It's called 5 Kernels of Corn, and some of you may have heard of it. It's it dates back to the early 19th century. And it is based on a legend that I can't find any evidence that it was true, but the spirit of it certainly was true. It refers to the first winter that the Pilgrims spent in Plymouth. That is before the first Thanksgiving. And during that time, they called it the starving time. And many people died of hunger, of a disease that ravaged them. And by Thanksgiving, only half of the original number of pilgrims were still alive. Well, that gives you just a sense of how terrible it was. And during the starving time, so the legend goes, the governor would hand out to each pilgrim 5 kernels of corn, and that was their allotment for the day. And before they ate it, according to the legend, they gave thanks, even for this meager amount of food. So the 5 kernels of corn in the early 19th century began to be placed on the Thanksgiving table of individual family homes. And I'd really like to see a revival of that tradition. For me, it symbolizes several things. One, the courage, the fortitude of the pilgrims and the terrible ordeal they went through when they first came here. Second, it exemplifies the generosity and the goodwill that the Wampanoans had toward the English. They taught them how to plant corn, they gave them corn, and it was thanks to these Native Americans that the Pilgrims were able to survive. And third, and perhaps most important, it symbolizes gratitude. The fact that the Pilgrims were able to, according to legend, give thanks even for this small amount of food helps us to, I think, on Thanksgiving Day, remember to give thanks for the many blessings that we all have. So with that, I will close, and I would welcome your questions. Thank you.
What a great talk. And what a fascinating little book. We're going to be selling this outside later if you would like one.
Yes.
But I was just thinking, wasn't that the day when the president requested that states do something instead of demand and threatened?
Yes, or passing a law, or
I didn't know that.
Or an executive order.
Yeah, so many wonderful things to learn.
Yeah.
If you would raise your hand, Melanie, I'll let you call on people.
Okay.
And if you give your name and your affiliation.
Yes,
There's one here.
thank you.
Madeline.
Wait for the mic, so because we're taping.
Sorry, yeah. Madeline Sullivan again, and I am with Senator Deb Fisher.
Uh-huh.
And my question is related to, you mentioned in 1941, that is when Thanksgiving became like the Thanksgiving that we know it is today. Could you talk more about the history of that?
Sure. Well, ever since Lincoln issued his the first in the modern series of national Thanksgiving proclamations, every president has issued a proclamation. But it did not carry the force of law. Instead, what he would do is he would issue the proclamation naming a day for Thanksgiving, and then the governors of the individual states would issue their proclamations. And many governors today issue, maybe all, I'm not sure, issue Thanksgiving proclamations. But anyway, the governors would issue their proclamations, and everybody would celebrate together. And the date, with a couple of exceptions, the date was almost always the last Thursday of November, which was the day that Washington had proclaimed. So it was a tip of the hat to Washington. Well, in 1939, Franklin Roosevelt had another idea. It was the middle of the Great Depression, and he called a press conference in August and announced that he was changing the date of Thanksgiving. It wasn't going to be on the last Thursday of November. He decided that it would be a week earlier. Why? Because he had the dumb idea that if the Christmas shopping season was a week longer, it would help, people would buy more, and it would help the economy, which was in depression. Now, this was a dumb idea because Americans didn't have more money. If they'd had it, they would have been happy to spend it, but they didn't have it. So, but in addition to that, it was not only a dumb idea economically, it was a dumb idea from from the point of view of most Americans who were used to celebrating on the last Thursday of November, and they erupted in protest, with the result that half of the states decided to, it was up to the governors. And so in 1939, they had to take into consideration politics, if the governor was a Democrat and Roosevelt was a Democrat. Could they really go against the party proposal? They had to take into politics. They also had to take into effect the impact it might have in their own state, because a lot of states, the football tradition had taken hold by then, and football schedules were such, and they were planned months in advance, that the championship game was usually played on Thanksgiving weekend. So this was another consideration that a lot of people were worried about. And they also just had to take into consideration traditions. The result was that about half the states celebrated on Roosevelt's Thanksgiving, and the other half celebrated on the traditional date. This went on for 3 years. Roosevelt's Thanksgiving came to be known as Franksgiving. And that's the story in brief. I go into it in more detail, but in the book. But my mother, who passed away now, I remember her telling me as how when she was a student in Boston during this time period, she couldn't go home for Thanksgiving because Buffalo, New York, where we're from, celebrated on Franksgiving. So, but it caused a lot of trouble. And then in 1941, Congress decided to act, and it passed legislation saying that Thanksgiving henceforth would be on the fourth Thursday of November, and Roosevelt signed it into law the day after Christmas in 1941. Lady in blue?
Kelly Billigmeyer, Heritage Foundation. Do you see a significant difference between the Thanksgiving before, where it's more of a community-driven holiday, versus now where it's individual and family, perhaps?
I hadn't really thought of it that way before, but certainly in the 17th century, when the Pilgrims and then subsequent settlers from England were celebrating, it may have, they were small settlements, so it may have been a more neighborhood kind of thing. The Pilgrims brought with them a tradition of a communal meal on a Thanksgiving Day. So that's perhaps one of the antecedents of the Thanksgiving dinner. At some point toward the end of the 17th century, the dinner took on a much larger importance than it originally had, and so some churches stopped their evening worship services, so to make way for people to have family meals more easily on that day. And then even Boston did so around the turn of the 18th century. But I do want to add one thing to that. The tradition of generosity centered around Thanksgiving has persisted ever since the beginning, and the shape has changed perhaps, but Americans are the world's most philanthropic people, and you see this most prominently around the holidays. People in the business of philanthropy refer to the giving season, which goes from Thanksgiving to Christmas, usually. That's where they often get a lot of their contributions. And Thanksgiving, there's a chapter on generosity in my book, and I look at some of these traditions. For example, I quote a letter from the 18th century during the Revolutionary War from a young woman who wrote about all the neighbors who came to dinner, 3 elderly ladies who didn't have husbands and didn't have any place to go on Thanksgiving, or 5 orphan children who were invited to join them, and then also some neighbors who had just moved in. And if you think about it, even today, one of the saddest images in American culture is somebody who doesn't have a place to go on Thanksgiving Day. And I certainly know lots of people who invite a colleague or a friend who, is away from home and needs a place to go on Thanksgiving. In addition to that, though, we also have a tradition of making sure that the less fortunate among us are well cared for on Thanksgiving Day. You think about all the food banks and the houses of worship that have Thanksgiving baskets or otherwise help people who might not otherwise be able to afford a good Thanksgiving dinner have one. And this tradition carries through to today. And finally, I'll also mention something that you may have heard of. It's a new tradition called Givingtuesday. It takes place on the Tuesday after Thanksgiving. It was started by the 92nd Street Y in New York City, which is a Jewish organization, and this is explicitly part of the Jewish tradition to serve the community. And it's when it's not an organization, it's just really a collaboration, and nonprofit organizations or groups of people who want to raise money try to do so on Giving Tuesday, the Tuesday after Thanksgiving. Yes.
Hi, Lisa with the Clare Booth Policy Institute as an intern. First, I want to thank you for mentioning Giving Tuesday. That's really awesome, and I know Clare Booth will be doing some stuff for that.
Oh, good.
My question for you today is, you mentioned that Washington sent out an original invite to the governors for their states to participate, but because of maybe the controversy around that first act that he took, were there any states who decided not to accept that invitation?
No. And when he sent the cover letter with the proclamation, they very quickly acceded to his request. And you can find how Washington's proclamation was reprinted in newspapers of the day. It was read from church pulpits on Sunday mornings. So it was very widely celebrated throughout the country. Washington's reputation was such that I think anything he requested just about was taken very seriously. I will point out that when Jefferson became president, a minister wrote to him, and we have the correspondence is quoted in my book. A minister wrote to him asking him to name a day of Thanksgiving, and he wrote back a very eloquent letter explaining why he wouldn't do so, that it wasn't his job as president to do this, though he had issued one when he was governor of Virginia. Yes?
I'm Sam Lianza from interning at Heritage, and you spoke about some of the first Thanksgivings outside of the traditional 1621 date, and I was just wondering if there have been any unique traditions that have been passed down, or if Thanksgiving, as we know it, mostly models the date we pick as the traditional date.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Those Thanksgivings have not really had an influence on the holiday we celebrate today, except in the sense that it sets a pattern for giving thanks and giving thanks to God. They were religious in origin. So, and Thanksgiving itself grows out of the Judeo-Christian tradition. So it just, in that sense, they kind of reinforce the habit of giving thanks. And so too do Native American Thanksgivings, which, if you want to be literal, were truly the first Thanksgivings on our continent. Yes? Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much for that. John Flo with the Heritage Foundation. I'm interested in the traditions of the food. The typical Thanksgiving foods.
You want me to get you hungry?
Yes. Do you find that there's huge changes in the typical Thanksgiving meal throughout the years? And also, do you think that there's any truth in that the bald eagle was chosen over the turkey for the American symbol so that we can continue to enjoy turkey for Thanksgiving?
I don't know anything about that, but I'm really glad we're not eating eagle for Thanksgiving. Although the Pilgrims did eat eagle. So, Well, if you want to eat what the Pilgrims and the Indians ate on your Thanksgiving Day, you should stock up on venison and oysters and mussels and corn. They may have had a turkey there. There are two eyewitness accounts, as I mentioned, and one of them mentions turkey in passing. And we know that wild turkey was very much available back then. The culinary history of the dinner is difficult to trace until you get to the end of the 18th century. And then the set Thanksgiving meal that's very similar to the meal we have today was taking shape. But basically from then until sometime in the 19th century, turkeys are mentioned a lot, but so are other meats, and people would typically have a big spread, and it would include roast beef and other meats and a roast goose and a roast turkey. And one of the features, this really surprised me, one of the features of Thanksgiving dinner, I mean a really important feature of Thanksgiving dinner, was chicken pot pie. And apparently, I met a woman from Maine who said that's still in her family's tradition. Then the second course, after all these various meats and side dishes, the second course was dessert. And again, it was a big spread, judging from the letters and other accounts I've read about dinner. And pie was heavily featured, including pies I had never heard of. And one is called Marlborough pie. Have any of you ever had a Marlborough pie? Well, this was very popular. It was a kind of apple pie, which had lemon in it and a kind of a custard base and no top crust, which sounds good. Indian pudding is a tradition in some families, and even plum pudding. You see accounts of that as well in desserts. But the basic tradition of eating too much was set by the Pilgrims, I think, back in 1621. Both of the accounts talk about the abundance, really dwell on the abundance of food. So in that sense, we're being historically accurate. Yes.
I'm Ansley. I'm with the Heritage Foundation, and I was just wondering what your opinion on Black Friday and Cyber Monday are, and if they've had negative effects on Thanksgiving, the traditional Thanksgiving, and just that.
Well, I kind of like Black Friday and Cyber Monday, and I think they say something positive about our society, which is that we're out there buying gifts for people, and in many cases, and also if we have the money to spend, it's a sign of prosperity, which is a positive thing, and it's also indicates that we're going to give more, we're going to spend more on in helping the causes we favor, because the more, history shows that the more money Americans have, the more they give to good causes. So I don't mind it so much. The debate about Good Friday and not Good Friday, pardon me, Black Friday and Cyber Monday, where people talk about it taking away from the meaning of Thanksgiving, really reminds me of the debate over football in the 19th century, where Americans were football crazy. Yeah, well, they still are, but and this idea of football and Thanksgiving was controversial, and people would debate whether it was the right thing to do on Thanksgiving, where you should spend it with family and you should be thinking about your blessings rather than going to a football game. And we all know that those arguments kind of lost out. But so, I'm not really too exercised by it. Yes. Yes.
Wait for the mic.
Wait for the mic, please.
Frida Hugley. I'm just a member of a Republican group. When did the Macys tradition start with the parade?
I don't really cover parades in my book, but I did research them. And it started in, I think it was the 1920s. It was pretty early in the 20th century, and other department stores hosted them as well. But the tradition goes back farther. A little. In New York City, neighborhoods would, in the 19th century, neighborhoods would hold parades. People would get together and dress up and march up and down the streets of the neighborhood. So, and I think other places did so. People around the country had different traditions for Thanksgiving. Like in Connecticut, there were some famous bonfires that they would hold on Thanksgiving Day in different parts of the state. But the department store Thanksgiving was, as I say, I think the 1920s. Bridget?
Thanks, Melanie. Bridget Wagner from Heritage. I'm just picking up on the traditions. When at the book launch event, one of the attendees mentioned their family tradition of reading a proclamation at the meal. And now that you've done a number of these events, I'm wondering what other kind of really wonderful family traditions have you heard about that you could share with us?
Well, the readings I've heard about that a lot, and it's sometimes the one you mentioned was trying to read one of the presidential proclamations, choosing a different president every year. But I included at the back of my book a section on readings, and these are short excerpts about Thanksgiving that famous Americans have written or said, and I'm kind of hoping to start a new tradition by including it that way. It's labeled Readings for Thanksgiving Day. Other traditions I've heard of are some families go around the table and ask everybody for something for which they're thankful, which is a nice tradition. Other traditions in my own family, we always at Thanksgiving make a contribution to an organization that helps feed the hungry, and I've heard other people say that as well. Many people have traditions of playing football. The other day I heard a tradition, oysters used to be a really popular part of Thanksgiving dinner, and that was back in the 19th century when oysters were cheap. And I met a man who is going home to his parents' house in Maryland, and they do an oyster roast on Thanksgiving morning, along with Bloody Marys, I think. And then they have dinner in the afternoon if they're, I guess, if they're still able to stand. But so I thought, now that's a nice tradition too. And, many families have a tradition of volunteering at a dinner for the poor. I have a friend who did so in a recent Thanksgiving, and she was, this Thanksgiving I was at a local church, and there was a church member who was the host of each table because they wanted the guests to feel that they were in a family-like atmosphere. They didn't want to do a big buffet where people just went through with a tray. Instead, they did it on Thanksgiving Day with members of the church scattered around with the guests. I thought that was a lovely idea as well.
What an excellent discussion. Thank you so much. We have some gifts here. We want to give you a couple little things. This is our limited edition Clare Boothe Luce Policy Institute coffee mug with her famous saying, it's a little snide for Thanksgiving.
No good deed goes unpunished.
And just hot off the press, our 2017 Great American Conservative Women Calendar. These are all women that have spoken for us. We want to give it to you. It's
Good, thank
practically
you.
warm, and our Clare Boothe Luce Policy Institute tote bag. Every woman needs it. There you go.
Well, I will carry this around New York City with great pleasure.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Very nice. And Melanie from Heritage, we want to give, ours is a limited edition as well, right, Bridget? Just want to make sure. Portfolio, this is for you.
Oh, excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you
Melanie,
so
thank
much.
you so much. This was really, I have one question for you. I know we
Yes.
don't have a lot of time, but one of the things that you wrote about in the book, it was actually early on, you talked about this newcomers high school that
Yes.
you went to. And I thought this was really interesting because you talked about how a lot of different cultures and countries have Thanksgiving-type holidays and traditions, but America's is unique, and how important it was for people coming to this country to understand it. And that I was surprised by how many of them actually already knew about it and were buying. Could you just speak to that really briefly?
Yeah, Newcomers High School, this was a place I actually went. It's a high school for immigrants in New York City in Queens. And I met with a bunch of students there. They came from the four corners of the earth. And their understanding, they had a personal understanding of what Thanksgiving meant. It wasn't just something in a history book. One boy said to me, he said, "I'm like the